The Murderous Politics of the 1930s. Communism is an ideology that calls for property to be owned by the community and wealth to be shared equally by all citizens. Karl Marx, the philosopher, social scientist, historian, and revolutionary. Karl Marx is without a doubt the most influential socialist thinker to emerge in the 19th century. He wrote the Communist Manifesto. It was an attempt to explain the goals of communism, as well as the theory underlying this movement. It argues that class struggles, or the exploitation of one class by another, are the motivating force behind all historical developments. They believed the workers or proletariats would eventually come to power in a communist revolution. Vladimir Lenin. He was a Russian statesman and Marxist theoretician. First premier of the Soviet Union, he formed the Bolsheviks and led them in the October Revolution in 1917, which established the Soviet government. He and the Bolsheviks, the Communist Party, created a bureaucratically, which is an official who is rigidly devoted to the details of administrative procedure, run state in which the party controlled all aspects of life. Another popular uprising was fascism, a form of government which is a type of one-party dictatorship. Fascists are against democracy. Fascism puts nation and often race above the individual. It stands for a centralized government headed by a dictator. Historically, fascist governments tend to be militaristic and racist. They worked within capitalist economies. By the late 1930s, fascist parties existed in most European countries. All opposed democracy and liberal values. All were aggressive nationalists. They singled out groups they regarded as enemies. Benito Mussolini. He promised to provide strong leadership, solve economic problems, regenerate the nation through military, and he was an opportunist. He rose to power in Italy. Zionism was the idea that the Jewish people constituted a nation and should return to their homeland in Palestine. They wanted to do this because of threats of anti-Semitism, and thousands migrated to Palestine in the 1930s. They purchased land and created settlements. By the late 1930s, Arabs had risen in rebellion against British colonial government and Jewish settlements. In China, nationalism was growing. Sun Yat-sen had three principles. He wanted to establish nationalism, democracy, and he wanted to rid the country of foreign influence. I'll give you some homework. Look up what nationalism means. Sun Yat-sen wanted a democratic government. First, he wanted a strong government and wanted people to become worthy citizens. He wanted to raise the standard of living for all. Germany under Hitler. Hitler created the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazis. In 1933, he was then President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor. The Nazis were the strongest political party at that time. He convinced the Reichstag to reorganize the state. In 1934, Hitler won the support of the army. He had unchallenged power and used the power to attack his enemies and advance his ideological views. He worked through both repression and persuasion. He was popular because the unemployment was reduced. He put people back to work. Then they started to rearm, which helped the unemployment. And he got Germany ready for war. There was a parliamentary democracy in Japan, but the real power lay with the army and the House of Peers, which are the more richer people. Their radical militarists expanded into Manchuria and China. not to mention Korea. There were terror campaigns in Tokyo. Latin America. In the 1930s, there were many military regimes. National service was required in the military. During the Depression, many saw a nationalist military as the best antidote to economic crisis and social chaos. And you have to remember, in Latin America, there was power vacuums after the Spanish left. So the various people coming into power, a lot were dictators. One such person was Vargas. He was from Brazil, and Brazil now has the 5th largest economy in the world. He represented a coalition of coffee growers, military men, and liberals, and he was determined to overhaul the political system. Vargas eliminated political parties and Congress. He was an advocate for a strong government. He provided for the economic needs of the country. Estado Novo meant a new state that stands above politics, and that was his motto. He ran an authoritarian state based on the power of the army and the police. The media sent strong messages during this period. A lot of these leaders made use of radio in service of the state. The BBC was created in Britain. Latin America had radio by the 1920s. Japan also had radio by the 1920s, which they used to foster nationalism and respect for the empire. In the U.S., particularly under Roosevelt, FDR, and the New Deal were the fireside chats. He used them to make people feel more secure about their future. A lot of time the radio was used for propaganda purposes, especially in Germany and in the Soviet Union. Information, especially of a biased or misleading picture, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. The United States, have we ever used propaganda? Well, I'll tell you, in World War II we did. I think you recognize this lady, Rosie the Riveter. Movies were used as a political tool, too. In India, there were reports on Gandhi's tour and his speeches. Gandhi knew how to use it and to gain home rule. He knew if he made the Britons look bad, that would help his cause. The Soviet Union, which had movies controlled by the state, portrayed the hero and heroines of the revolution. The U.S., the movie companies, meanwhile, were in private hands. Their films were generally optimistic. But during the war, they did do sorts of propaganda in their films. In Germany, there was a woman named Leni Riefenstahl. She turned propaganda into an art. She was in the movie, or she created the movie Triumph of Will in 1935. It chronicled the 1934 Nazi Party Congress in Nuremberg, which was attended by more than 700,000 Nazi supporters. Even in the Depression, films worked more to divert audiences than to pay attention to the problems of the day. Hollywood politics were patriotic even without censorship or state ownership. The U.S. Federal Arts Project in the New Deal. The Federal Arts Project was a New Deal program to fund the visual arts in the United States. Under National Director Hogarth Cahill, it was one of the 5 federal Project Number 1 projects sponsored by the Works Project Administration and the largest of the New Deal art projects. And this is just a new example. The more modern artwork in those times was more realistic than the previous impressionistic or modernization type of art. In Mexico, the state commissioned painting on public buildings to represent histories and values. One of the most well-known artists at this time who did a lot of the works on buildings was Diego Rivera, a memorable picture in the 20th century, actively painting during the 50 years from 1907 to 1957. Mexican by birth, Rivera spent a good portion of his adult life in Europe and the United States, as well as his home in Mexico. And he is well known for his murals. And this is one of his murals. Oftentimes it represents the past and the indigenous people in the past. As I said, it replaced modernism, the artwork at this time, and represented how things really were. So impressionists such as Van Gogh here, who was popular previously, his sort of art went out of vogue at the time. As did this. This is a picture from Picasso, and it was a modernistic view. And at this time, everything turned to realism because of the hardships of the age.